It was a bright day, surprisingly warm for early November, and Alfie pulled his cap down low over his eyes to keep the sun out. His hands still stank of urine and he longed to wash them, so when he noticed a fountain in the centre of the lawn, he ran towards it and thrust his hands in the stagnant water, telling himself that however bad they smelled when they came out, it couldn't be any worse than they smelled now. Shaking them dry in the air, he considered the long gravel pathway that ran along the side of the hospital and decided to see where it led. Arriving at a clump of trees, he stared around the grounds and sighed in frustration. If he turned to his left, he would be heading back towards the drive and the front gates, the train station in London, and his secret mission would end in failure. To his right was the hospital itself, filled with its terrible patients, and nothing in the world could have persuaded him to go back inside. He felt sorry for these wounded soldiers, but they didn't seem human to him somehow, and he wondered why the doctors were not doing more to help them. There hadn't even been a nurse in the ward, or a doctor to help the poor man who had been horrified by the whistle of the kettle. Didn't anyone take care of them? Wasn't it somebody's job to look after them? Was this what it was like in Margie's hospital? He could imagine that his mother would leave patients to suffer as badly as these unfortunate men. He couldn't imagine that his mother would leave patients to suffer as badly as these unfortunate men. If his father really was here, he would never leave him in such misery. He wanted to be brave and keep searching, but he began to feel a sense of panic at being so far from home. He'd never ventured outside a few square miles of London before, and now he'd taken a train to another county more than 2 hours away. And the truth was, he felt terrified. He hated this hospital. He hated the building, the horrible smell, the terrible people, the awful groaning. He hated all of it and just wanted to go home. For some reason, Joe Patience's missing tooth and purple, green and yellow eye came into his mind, and he wondered why he hadn't cared about what had happened to his father's oldest friend, why he hadn't asked whether he was all right. Georgie would have stopped. Alfie just kept on walking. He turned round and was about to make his way back in the direction he'd come from when he caught sight of an opening in the bushes to his left a couple of 100 yards away. The hedges were all as neatly trimmed as the grass, but there was a gap there the width of a doorway that led to another garden beyond, and something, in the spirit of exploration perhaps, made him want to know what it looked like in there. The gap led to a corridor of hedges that twisted and turned like a maze. He walked along one, then back up the next before heading down a third. Only when he reached the end did the hedges part completely, leading to a wonderful flower garden, laid out in formal blocks with paths separating the beds and a small pond at the end. And to his surprise and dismay, there was another group of men out here, half a dozen of them, seated in large bath chairs at some distance from each other, each one wearing a dressing gown and holding a heavy tartan rug across his knees. One man was quite close to Alfie, and the boy looked at him nervously. The furthest was some distance away, his back to him, and a sun hat pulled down over his bowed head. Alfie slipped back in amongst the hedges as a nurse walked between the men, saying a few words to each one before continuing on her way. She disappeared through another opening in the hedges further along, and Alfie stepped out again. A small table stood in the corner. On it were some books, a couple of newspapers, a few apples and a pitcher of water. He walked over and had a look. The front pages had been taken away from the papers, so all that was left was some fairly insignificant news about problems with the miners and details of a new education bill that was going through Parliament. There was a picture of King George and Queen Mary at an exhibition, and another of the Prince of Wales giving a speech to a group of nurses. Alfie couldn't help himself. He was thirsty. He took a clean glass, poured himself some water and swallowed it down in one gulp, giving a satisfied "ah" when he was finished. He turned and looked at the young man seated closest to him, who was watching him carefully. He had greasy black hair that fell low over his forehead and a stubbly beard. There was something about his face that made Alfie think that this was what old Bill Hemperton might have looked like when he was young Bill Hemperton. Who are you?" the man asked, stuttering over the words, looking down at the ground as he said them. "No one," said Alfie. "You must be someone," he said. Alfie thought about repeating the line about being the milkman's son, but something made him not want to tell a lie to this man, even though it wasn't really a lie, only sort of a lie. I'm just," he said. "I'm just looking for a patient, that's all." The man nodded and beckoned him over. Alfie wasn't sure. The man put his hand out and waved the fingers casually. "Come closer," he said. This time, Alfie stepped over carefully. "Closer," repeated the man. Alfie came closer, and again the man said it in a sort of sing-song voice this time. "Closer!" By now, Alfie's face was almost beside the young man's, and he twisted suddenly in his chair, grabbing the boy's chin in his hand. I won't go. Do you hear me? He hissed, his voice low, spit flying from his lips and landing on Alfie's face. I won't go. You can't meet me. Take one of the others. You can't meet me. Do you hear? Alfie pulled away, gasping, and spun round, looking for the exit. But the hedges all seemed to have grown closer together now, and the sun was shining down with such ferocity that he couldn't see what he was doing. He turned round and began to feel dizzy, picking a direction and running. He had to get out. He had to get home. He couldn't stay in this awful place any longer. He ran one way, certain that it would bring him back to where he had started. But no, it only took him to the end of the garden, to the man in the last seat with his head bowed low and the sun hat on. Alfie ran past him, looked ahead. There was no way out. He turned back, and this time he saw the exit in the distance and breathed a sigh of relief, glancing at the man in the bath chair for only a moment as he passed him. But it was long enough for the shock of recognition to hit him, and he turned back and stared. The man looked up, and Alfie gasped. "Dad," he said. Georgie Summerfield was sitting in the bath chair, biting his nails as he looked at his son, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he was uncertain of who he was, before shaking his head and looking down, staring at his slippers. He was thinner than Alfie remembered. His cheekbones were more pronounced, his eyes seemed enormous, and his lips were very white, with little flakes of dryness crusted upon them. "Dad, it's me!" he cried, rushing forward. "It's Alfie!" Georgie didn't seem to know him, and kept staring at his slippers while shaking his head. He started to mumble, but Alfie couldn't hear the words. He leaned close, but none of it made any sense to him. "In the last one, of course, where they kept the tin pots. Who was it? It was Humberside. He was always the best of them. No, maybe not. There was Petey too. They got him in the end. He went down with the ship. That's what I heard, while the rest of us were there doing God knows what. Stay where you are and then leave. That's what they told us, over and over. What sense does that make anyway? There was what was it? A grapefruit? No, of course not. There weren't any grapefruits there. I'm mistaken. Dad!" cried Alfie, putting his hands on his father's shoulders, which had lost some of the muscle that had been there before. Georgie used to have such strong shoulders from lifting the milk churns. "Dad, don't you know it's me? It's me, Alfie." Georgie glanced up again, but showed no sign of recognition. He smiled and looked back down. Seemed as if he was about to start talking again, but thought better of it, and said nothing at all, sitting there immobile, saying nothing, doing nothing, looking at nothing. "Dad, please," whispered Alfie. "I've come all this way to find you, to save you." But Georgie simply sighed. It was as if he couldn't hear him. Alfie stood up and looked around in despair. He studied the other men, but none of them could help him. He'd found his father. He'd come all this way and he'd found him. He wasn't on a secret mission for the government. That had been a lie, and everyone knew it except him. But what did it matter? Georgie didn't even recognise him anymore. He didn't know his own son. "Dad!" he pleaded. No response. "Dad!" He could feel tears forming in his eyes, but was determined not to cry. Instead, he stayed rooted to the spot, watching the men rocking back and forth, some of them mumbling to themselves, others not, and then noticed the table with the papers and the water on it once again, and had an idea. He ran over, picked up one of the newspapers before folding it in half and reaching into his pocket. Walking back across the garden, he stood in front of his father with the folded newspaper before him, and Georgie looked at the boy, stared at the newspaper, and then back up at his son with a curious expression on his face. "Look what I've got for you," said Alfie, opening the paper and showing him the apple drop, the single apple drop that Marion Bancroft had given him in the railway carriage and which he'd put in his pocket for later. Georgie stared at it, his eyes focusing on this little sphere of green, yellow and red, before the signs of recognition appeared slowly on his face. He swallowed and looked up at his son. "Alfie," he said.